AI never sleeps. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Ash Bennington, joined as always by Mikhail. And today we're joined by a new guest for the first time, Doug Stewart. Welcome, one and all.
Good to be here.
We were doing a little bit of intros before the camera started rolling, and I figured, what the hell, let's do this live. Let's talk a little bit about our backgrounds here, because I think this is going to be an interesting conversation, particularly for you, Doug, and Mikhail, as you find the intersections between what you guys do. Doug, this is your first time with us. Tell us a little bit about what it is you do.
So interestingly, I started as an application developer in the pre-Google days, and since then have lived at that intersection of business and technology. So people have a bunch of money, they want an outcome, they don't know exactly how to get there, and I help them piece together the technology to drive the outcome.
Mikhail, I know folks are already familiar with you, our resident AI expert, but let's go through it again. Talk a little bit about your background because you had an interesting journey to get here.
I started in neuroscience back in college, where I was working on some really fundamental learning systems. And when I say fundamental, slugs and other invertebrates, but that's neither here nor there. Nowadays, what I do is
Mikhail, this is like your best Bond villain mode ever. You're literally stroking a cat while talking about working on slug nervous systems.
Yes, we're all just little nervous systems in one form or another. And nowadays, our computers are included in that encompassment of us. Now, what I do nowadays is adapt LLMs and other breaking AI technologies to clients with existing business processes. A lot of folks out there are reading about AI. They know that AI is going to either take their job or eat their lunch or both. And as we've said many times on this show, AI won't take your job. The guy who's using AI to magnify his own output tenfold, that's the guy who's going to take your job. So be that guy instead of the other 9 schmucks. So mostly what I do is I help people adapt to this new AI reality. If you've got a business process, if you've got a client service process, if you've got something that is consuming a lot of your budget that can be replaced by breaking AI technology or enhanced, not necessarily replaced, then I'm the guy that wires up those connections.
So it's really interesting. You guys are both coming at this kind of like the bridge from two sides of the river, right? You have the guy who's doing the business analysis on the one side, bridging to the technology, and the guy who's doing the technology on the other side, bridging over to the business. And I should say, Mikhail, because talking about your expertise in this, you're a longtime developer prior to AI. I think Google and Microsoft.
I worked at Microsoft in their speech recognition labs long before Cortana or Alexa or Siri or anything like that. They were doing very early forms of language processing that are a very primitive ancestor of what these LLMs that we work with today are. I can go into lots of technical detail on that. I saw more of the business end of things when I worked at Google in New York. I worked in their DoubleClick division and was part of the ad placement process. The ungodly complicated data analytic systems that look into what ads a user should see at any given time based both on how much the ad provider is paying, and the advertiser rather, and also what demographics the user matches, and trying to maximize the revenue seen by the advertiser and the products enjoyed by the user, and trying to do it all within the few hundred milliseconds that happen while the browser is loading.
Interesting stuff. Listen, let me ask you this and talk about detail. I know that you could drill down here very deeply, but just for the sake of framing the narrative at the highest level, like literally the elevator pitch version, we're filming this conversation here in the second week of April. Where are we right now? What's happened in the last few weeks? And what's the current state of play in AI so that we can jump in and talk about it from some different perspectives?
Let's look at some of the things that have been breaking headlines in the last couple of weeks to put people's minds into perspective as they view this, presumably on a podcast binge at some point in the future. Hello, future people. So, first of all, last week, I think, OpenAI released a new rendering engine for GPT that allows them to create new images in the chat itself. Ash, you and I might have talked about that a little bit, I don't recall. But the general gist is that right now, everybody is using that generator to transform themselves into Studio Ghibli characters. If all of you future people think back on those couple of weeks when everybody was changing their Facebook profiles to Studio Ghibli, that's happening right now.
All right, so Doug, this is really interesting. This worked out even better than I thought. You guys are really coming at this, like I said, building the bridge from opposite sides of the river. You're talking to a lot of clients right now in the business world who are thinking about this and maybe feeling some of that anxiety and pinch that Mikhail was just describing. What are you hearing out there?
So it's interesting because I got brainwashed years ago by a guy who's a novelist, analyst, and thinker from Gartner that got a chance to meet named Richard Hunter. And he wrote this book called The Real Value of IT. And what he was trying to describe is that it's not really about the capabilities of a technical platform, it's about what outcome you can actually deliver. And I think the most interesting thing that's happened over the last 2 years is like in pharma last year. We did lots of AI use cases, and they were almost always information management use cases. Hey, I have data from 17 places. I have to do this laborious process to collect it. Essentially, give me a chatbot that makes my life easier. And by the time something that improves efficiency gets to the approval board, they want you to point to the line item on the income statement or the balance sheet and say, how much is this going to go down if we fund this? And people are reluctant to give up headcount and operational expense. And I think what's happened as the hype cycle has evolved is we're really starting to get into the business outcome business. So, for instance, today was talking to somebody that runs an agency of brokers, right, that sells a product on behalf of somebody else. And there's a really overly complicated mechanism by the way their commission gets distributed, and they're one level removed from the actual supplier of the product that they're selling, right? So essentially, they pay people to compare things between lists, and it's relatively expensive. So it was, how can you make me sure that the quality of the information I have is correct and do it instantaneously so that I don't have all this administrative expense? And the interesting thing Mikhail said, I think that in a lot of ways, it's not just the guy who's using it that's going to take your job. I think it's the smaller organizations that are more innovative are going to start being able to deliver things at a much better rate and lower cost than a lot of the big players will. The big enterprise organizations will have governance and they'll be thinking in a tier. They create lots of PowerPoint decks. And the process to actually get something delivered to production is going to be maybe 3 to 6 months if you're lucky. And that's just to get the money and the approval. The smaller organization that generates, they're easily $150 million of revenue, but they're able to do this very quickly. And they're focusing on an outcome where other people, they might have to slay some legacy dragons or aggregate data across different acquired systems. The smaller players almost have the ability to jump from the 90s to tomorrow, skipping over all of the investment that are the big data wave and the web-based wave and all of these different waves. They've invested $0 in that, are really quickly getting to the point where they can drive an actual outcome very quickly, which I think is interesting, right? And it's going to shift in this particular case, it'll shift the activities of the agency to start thinking about things that sort of fuel business growth a little bit more. How can I target people using a new mechanism that other people haven't tapped into yet? Today it was there's an intersection between like financial services and retirement planning with the cost of healthcare in this particular circumstance. How can I start to build those bridges very quickly and get brand new revenue sources to grow? And I think it's traditionally it's a business that's driven largely by employment population. And I think it's interesting. It's going to get on the lower part of the poll, it's going to get scrappy. I think people need to take that into consideration. It's going to get very scrappy for the innovators.
It's really interesting to you frame it out that way because you basically have this kind of almost like innovator's dilemma, and you have this challenge where you have folks who have zero sunk cost, right? And they don't have any of us pesky humans saying, "Oh no, you can't do it that way because my job's on the line." Mikhail, jump in. You were going to say.
Oh, absolutely. I love Doug's use of the word scrappy. I think that hits the nail on the head. During any period of disruption, which we're very much living through right now, you're going to get favorable performance by the agile players. The smaller, more agile groups are always going to be better at adapting to the new paradigms than the entrenched institutions. That's just the nature of the game. That's been the case since the Stone Age gave way to the Chalcolithic Age. The folks who could smelt better copper still did better than the folks who were still relying on old supply chains. Right now, I'm seeing this with my own clients, exactly what Doug is describing, which is where the really big institutions are trying to use AI to optimize their existing workflows or to perform their existing workflows better, whereas the smaller institutions are realizing that AI has rendered their entire workflow obsolete and are trying to replace the entire pipeline. So there's a huge difference between the two. If you're a big player and you're hearing this, the key thing you should keep in mind is, do you really need a 7-step process by which to deliver Form 501c817 from Debbie in accounts receivable down to Brad in accounts receivable? Or do you just need to not use that form in the first place?
Mikhail, I'll tell you one thing. If I'm getting paid for steps 3 through 7, I'm going to argue that it's certainly the case that you need it.
So, Mikhail, I'm interested in your opinion on this because a lot of the organizations, especially people that are cash cows like pharmas, insurance, financial services, they've played this strategic position where they benefit best from fast follower, right? They don't have research and development divisions, and they wait to see some level of success that's driven by the true innovators, and then they slip into fast follower position to minimize the R&D costs. And I think what you're starting to see is that it takes small organizations and puts them into either fast follower or even leading competitive positions. And I foresee this wave of the innovators are going to have a decision point, the ones who are successful, where it's what do I do? Do I grow or do I become acquired? So I think the big players are probably already thinking about, let's wait for somebody else to have some success here, and they'll turn into sort of M&A mode and just starting to acquire some of those capabilities. But it makes that thing you're talking about, that fundamental like core stack of capabilities, even more onerous to maintain. So I wondered, like, strategically what you thought about that.
I think that if you're a small player, you should be aiming for a buyout as your exit strategy. And if you're a big player, you shouldn't be trying to adapt AI at all in the first place. You should be hunting for little guys to buy out because they're going to do it better than you could anyway. And by the way, we've seen this before. All three of us here are old farts at this point. We saw this play out in the late 90s.
It's true.
Like, this is exactly how the dot-com revolution happened. You had big players like IBM. Did they develop their own S for PCs? No, they hired some random schmo at Harvard. 2 random dudes in Cupertino working in their parents' garage created one of the most successful computer companies of all time. This goes all the way back to a pair of brothers who ran a bicycle repair business, ended up succeeding where an entire half-century's worth of aerodynamics experts failed.
It's so interesting. It's not just fixed cost. It's also the fixed mindset, right? Oh, this is how we do it around here. When I've got 37 people working for me who are going to tell me I'm a genius because I'm their boss, and I determine whether or not they get a bonus at the end of the quarter or the end of the year. And this is how we've always done it. And this is our structures and these are our incentives. And then you see Steve Jobs famously used to say it, I'm not worried about. And he would then list all the companies that are really, frankly, no longer with us. DEC and those other computer companies that nobody under 30 has ever.
SunSpark and SGI.
Sun Microsystems was a giant. It acquired Silicon Graphics. Later, these companies no longer exist. And IBM tried to build Microsoft DOS, right? They from, what was it, TPM or something like that? Nobody will remember this. But the idea is like, boy, it must be a great time to be an innovator, but God, it has to be scary to be one of the probably 99 out of 100 people who are working for those companies.
So Doug used the really great word serfdom or fiefdom. It was fiefdom, right?
Fiefdom. I think it was fiefdom, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect description of the sort of rent-seeking, grift establishment, institutionalization of, frankly, what, in my very cynical opinion, represents about 90 to 99% of the U.S. workforce. But and on the one hand, like, that's exactly what's going to be attacked by AI. So, like, on the one hand, that's great because it optimizes the vast majority of work. On the other hand, that's probably your work. So, for any given instance of you.
Look, we can chuckle about it, but the reality is that there are people out there who are watching this. There are lawyers and accountants and engineers who are watching this conversation going, holy hell, this might be coming from my business. What do I do? What do we tell people who are really concerned about this, who see the promise of this technology, and who also understand that this creative destruction may wind up washing away the leader in the industry that they maybe work for? That's a real question that I know is on a lot of our viewers and listeners' minds right now.
Yeah, I can certainly give my opinion on this. After playing with these models, what you found is the ability to do prompt engineering and model tuning is pretty elaborate, and it takes you can right out of the box get a language model to be about 60% accurate. And then the remainder of that path of how you actually improve accuracy to the point where autonomy is something that's even in the mirror is actually really difficult. And it's not like there's a ton of frameworks that I've found that will identify for you, like what's the perfect data source. So in the example I was talking about before, you can put product information and things that require manual lookups and put those into a language model and learn from it. But when it really starts getting good is when you feed it with information that mimics the way you want it to behave. So in this example I was talking about, we loaded all kinds of product information, just access to a wealth of data. But when it really starts getting good is when you took a conversation between a really high-performing sales agent and a consumer, took those conversations and started loading those into the language models so you can build something that's a lot more human, a lot more accurate. We saw the results just drastically start to improve. And the longer you do it, the more edge cases you can build into it. And yeah, I think that's what I've seen.
A lot of my programmer colleagues have asked me whether or not AI is going to take their jobs. A lot of junior folks in particular are really scared of it, and they have a right to be. But for the senior folks, what I've told them is that these language models can only program as well as the client can explain what exactly it is that they want. And that's why our jobs are safe, because hypothetically speaking, even if these things were perfect software engineers, it wouldn't matter because they can crank out exactly what the client is asking for, but it's not what the client actually wants or needs. And I actually had a really great case recently of a day trader. He was a beginner day trader who worked with GPT to write a Python script that would implement a certain trading strategy for him. It was a very simple strategy for day traders listening in. It's related to martingale, and that should already be setting off alarm bells for folks who are in the know. And so the problem is that he didn't know about the pitfalls of, for example, GPT in particular is really bad at yes manning. You give it an idea and it'll say that's brilliant regardless of whether it's horrible or not. So it implemented a Python script for him, and he had the good sense at least to ask me, we know each other through some friend channels, to take a look at this script before he actually hooked it to his bank account. And it's a darn good thing he did, because he would have lost his shirt he would have gone bankrupt in a day if this thing had actually run. It basically implemented his strategy exactly as he asked, but did not warn him about what's going to happen. For example, he didn't take slippage into account. Like, the guy didn't take into account the fact that, like, the price you buy at isn't necessarily going to be the same as the price that you place the order at. And he didn't take volume into account and just all sorts of things, right? And so there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on in the world right now, and that's why guys like me have a job.
Yeah, it's Watson on Jeopardy, right? You remember the famous Watson answer on Jeopardy?
I don't remember the specific answer.
So it's live television. IBM's doing this big thing. They're going to promote AI, and one of the Jeopardy contestants was IBM Watson.
Yes.
And during one of the first episodes, somebody answers a question incorrectly, and then Watson buzzes in next. And Watson gives the exact same answer. So nobody had actually gone through the process to be like, don't repeat the incorrect answer. And that one event was talked about in corporate media and through social circles. And just, it was like the beginning of the end for Watson. It was really bad. But to your point, it's like, there's a human connection of this. And as you forwarded an article in Nature that was like, if you ask researchers all over the world, is there going to be a benefit or a detriment? It was no surprise, right, that certain countries were like, this is going to help us. And it's China, the United States, the UK, leading the drivers of commercial activity. But when you go to the interesting part is when you go down to the bottom and you say, what are your biggest fears? People think it's going to make your life more convenient and all this stuff. One of the biggest fears across the board was about authenticity. your ability to determine the truth of core information. And if you think about that in particular, right, and this trend for the way that we get information and the way we look at authenticity, there is nothing more human than that. There's nothing more human than that. And I do not foresee a day when we get to that, I'm talking to an artificial human being that seems exactly like a person. I don't see that coming anytime soon or even at all.
I see it coming at all. I see it coming in our lifetimes, but it's not around the corner. There's a few heuristics that need to be hammered out first.
What's that? The Turing test. That's what I was trying
Yeah.
to think of. So you think we're on our way to the Turing test, and that's going to be
Easily. Technically, the Turing test has been passed already many times over, but a lot of it has to do with knowing what kind of person you're talking with. And for example, there's an old saying about the Turing test that both a supermodel and a mannequin look the same if viewed through a fuzzy plate glass window, like a dirty, scratched up plate glass window. So the idea is that if the manner in which you're interacting with an agent on the other side is limited by virtue of how fast you can type and whether or not they have a vocal modality and stuff like that, then you're already dealing with a limited interface that prevents you from seeing some of the things that would enable you to tell the difference between a human versus an AI. The analogous situation is that if you're on a customer service call, for example, you're not really dealing with a human operating in human mode. Most of the people whom we interact with on a day-to-day basis, especially in customer service, are just operating in NPC mode in the first place. And so can we mimic that modality? Yes. I think we're already there pretty solidly.
that pendulum is going to swing back towards like face-to-face interactions over digital interactions when they get that realistic, that human need to connect and have some level of like authenticity and accountability. I wonder if that's where it'll go.
That's funny because I see it going exactly the opposite direction where we start treating people more like machines because we get used to the convenience of dealing with machines. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean. You're having a conversation with, let's say, a really annoying friend who starts going on about some story that happened during their day that you really don't care about. So you just say, skip.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
That's dystopian, man.
Now, I'm not saying that I've ever done that, but let's just say the inclination is there.
I have been guilty in those situations of telling people like, "Oh, really? Tell me more about that," and setting the phone and walking away for a few minutes. Yeah, I've been guilty of that.
I'm just literally talking about press B to skip. That's just boom, just.
So, we talk about the Turing test. It reminds me of a story back in the olden days.
In the dark days of 2023, when the story came out that essentially Bill Gates had been talking with the
folks at OpenAI and said, listen, you come back to me when you can pass the AP bio exam. Said it as a dismissive thing to kick the can down the road. And 6 months later, the team came back and said, we've been able to get like a 98. I forget what the exact score is on the AP bio exam. And it's shocking to think of that idea that 2 years ago this seemed to be science fiction, not to me, what do I know, but to Bill Gates. The idea that the technology was moving so fast that Bill Gates was blindsided by it. I've been sending out pictures when people ask me and say, carp about the limitations of some of these LLMs right now. I send them pictures of a 1980s cell phone, the ones in the briefcases that you used to carry around, and said, dude, this is where we are right now, today.
Yeah.
Except it's not going to take 30 years because software does not move at the speed of hardware. And this is something that it's just going to move very quickly. All the points that we've talked about here today. But let me ask you this for people, and just an actionable question. We've talked a lot about people who are in technology already, who have very high levels of technology. But if you're watching this, if you are a doctor, if you are a lawyer, if you are an engineer, if you are an accountant, you've got questions. So what's your advice for people who are looking at this going, oh man, this is moving fast. I want to know what I need to do in my career.
You want to go first, Mikhail? Or you want me to go first?
I think you should go first, Doug. Ash has asked me this already many times. I think we need to hear a fresh voice on here.
This is, yeah, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the interesting thing about that, I think, is there are some endeavors that I uncynically think are always going to be human endeavors, like by industry, right? Like the law in particular is so fluid and so subject to human opinion, thought, ethics, what your framework is. It's almost, if you're going to be in a world where technology is not a hurdle and what you're really focusing on is achieving a particular outcome, and that outcome requires knowledge, then pursuing something that you enjoy really should be where the fruit of your labor is. You're not going to be able to envision or imagine some type of an outcome or even put the effort in to do it. I think what'll shift is education that's based upon your ability to memorize a very large amount of information will become much less valuable, certainly. And I think the skills that will become more valuable are some of the softer skills. Like if everything is done automatically through machines, then what's the value of empathy and true empathy, which a lot of industries need to consider. I did a lot of work in healthcare, and there was lots of marketing talk about personalization and what that means, and the idea that if you target a message towards a particular consumer, the more that you can hit those moments that matter most, the more compelling you'll have for sort of member engagement. And it's all very sort of corporate centric. It's about how can I lower costs? How can I increase sales? And the topic came up that when your members or your patients lose mobility because of something that happened, what do you do for them? And it was silence. And the next question was, so do you offer like home delivery based services for, let's say, prescriptions? And of course, everyone does, right? So connect those two dots. And when you're focused on, the technical aspects of a particular technology or a subject area, you lose the ability to think empathetically. And these were customer experience experts, but it had never occurred to people to put themselves in the head of, okay, I'm a person who's very independent, who's working, and I just lost the ability to walk for some period of time. What is it that actually would matter to me? And the idea that if somebody who obviously knew about that event was like, hey, here's something I could do to actually make life easier for you, I think that's going to be of tremendous value. It's things like creativity, empathy, not the ability to assemble information really quickly, but the ability to put it together in order to build something new or to drive some new outcome. And it shortens that cycle between creative thought and ability to drive an outcome. That would be in the broad sense, but it's still going to get back to you do the things that you're passionate about because it'll be where your interest is. And maybe more so than when you're a kid and your parents are like, you can be whatever you want when you grow up. It's a little bit more, what do you really care about? What really drives you in terms of intellectual pursuits and go for that. I also think manual trades, things in the physical world that absolutely will never be automated or are very difficult to automate. I think those are great pursuits. And that includes like performing arts.
I couldn't agree more, especially with regard to the manual trades, which is ironic because it's exactly the opposite of what parents have been telling their children for the last 3 generations at least. But
100%.
Here we are, like the intellectual pursuits are the ones that let me rephrase what I was about to say. The disingenuous intellectual pursuits are the ones that are easiest to fake with AI. Like the pursuits that you could achieve by just turning off your own sentience and just cranking out white papers or cranking out documents, serving as middle management in some giant corporate bureaucracy. Those things that you went to college for, those are precisely the things that are the easiest to completely do away with. First
100%.
by AI and second of all, like just completely. Now, you hit on something really valuable, Doug, which is something that AI still can't achieve and won't be able to achieve until we're in serious trouble. Theory of mind. Everything you just talked about with regard to how a doctor approaches a patient that just lost mobility, for example, how an advertiser might actually connect to a customer that actually might care about their product rather than simply being sold to, entirely involves being able to understand the actual internal experience of another person. And that requires actually using the neurons in your human prefrontal cortex. And that's something that AI at best can only mimic still, and for at least a good few years yet. Now, the problem is that this involves genuine engagement, genuine empathy, and using the process of medicine or advertising or legalese as a starting point rather than as a target. The machines can already implement the process for you. What you need to do now is apply the theory of mind to actually understand how the process will be received. And here's one of the best ways that I can put it is that all 3 of us, and I'm sure everybody listening to this, can tell the difference between Hollywood schlock that's just cranked out by some garbage writer who was hired to produce some narrative that fulfills some checklist that's defined by a committee versus an actual piece of art that's created by a writer that has a genuine vision and a story that they want to tell.
Hey,
One
I
has
thought Speed 2 was great. You don't have.
I'm pretty sure that if I asked GPT to write Speed 17 right now, it could give us a very compelling script. My point is that you can if there are writers that know that they are writing to an audience that not only have a story to tell, but that also know how an intelligent, like genre savvy audience will receive that story. And they're unfortunately very few and far between, but they do exist and they're beautiful. And we can always tell when a writer is writing to fulfill checkboxes defined by committee. And let's face it, we can also tell when a writer has a story to tell, but doesn't care whether or not the audience enjoys it or not. They're just writing as a substitute for going to therapy. So the engagement of a theory of mind is the defining characteristic between whether or not the piece of media that's produced is actually something that will be perceived as having quality.
So what's interesting about that is that the original question was like, what advice do you give to people in certain particular trades? And I think the framework that I had going into it was in terms of like training or formal education. But what do you think about other ways that people develop skills in the theory of mind? Public service or travel or family formation?
I think that having kids is probably the best way to see just what narcissistic little sociopaths human beings really are deep down inside in their own worlds.
You were doing so well. There was so much optimism until that moment.
So that's like tier 0 of your human tech level, right? Is that like you start as a toddler and then you wrap around on top of that, and like deep inside there's still that toddler. And so like you start with that, and then if you can learn to deal with that, then you're probably going to be okay. The focus on soft skills really is something interesting because Ash, I forget if I mentioned this to you or not, but like I've been finding that when it comes to prompt engineering, so my entire career as a software engineer, I've always written software based on intelligence as my primary character attribute. A really great software project basically hinges on whether or not you can roll progressively harder and harder intelligence checks. With prompt engineering, while intelligence is important, your chief character attribute becomes wisdom. Are you explaining yourself properly? Are you actually communicating what you think you're communicating? Are there underlying assumptions that you're placing but failing to state? Just how much self-awareness do you have? And all of without that, like you're not going to get anywhere with prompt engineering, and you're not going to get anywhere with programming as it's going to look as the years go on and software engineering becomes more and more of a task that's just done by the computers themselves.
I'm so grateful to be human. But listen, I want to jump in here and follow suit on the optimism train about this and say, you've already taken the first step. Right. You're watching this podcast, you're listening to this podcast, you've already joined the conversation. Opportunity is not disappearing. It may be transforming. The world may look different in a year or two or in 6 months. But the reality is that you still have something to contribute. I think you guys have highlighted very well the sort of natural human attributes, empathy, the ability to see things, to synthesize information, to do things that computers are not very good at yet and may never really get to the level of humanity at. So join the conversation. Keep doing this. By the way, I should say this is still very early. And if you're listening to this, if you're participating in this conversation, you are early to the table. You're thinking about it. You're proactive. You're imagining what's going to happen next. The good news about new technology is it tends to level playing fields in ways that produce opportunity for insurgents versus incumbents. I think that's certainly going to be the case this time around. But join the conversation, remain in the conversation. And thank you so much for joining us, Doug and Mikhail. Great conversation as always, guys.
Been a delight.
Good to see you.
Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.